9:02 a.m. on April the 19th, 1995. That's the moment when 27-year-old Timothy McVeigh exploded his way into the US history books, blowing up a gigantic truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The blast annihilated the building. It ended 168 lives, including those of 19 children. It also sent a shockwave throughout the nation. No one could believe such an atrocity was carried out by a fellow American, especially one as normal-seeming as McVeigh. Yet McVeigh's callousness, it didn't spring from nowhere. He was a decorated war veteran, a Second Amendment crusader, and a far-right activist. More than that, he was a product of his time, a monster born from some of the most controversial actions the federal government has ever been involved in. A quiet loner, a bullied kid who never fit in, McVeigh was the most average boy imaginable. And in the video today, the story of how that boy became America's deadliest terrorist. If you drive to upstate New York to the town of Pendleton today, you'll find a small blue-collar community identical to a million others across America. There's no historic marker here. There's nothing to commemorate the town that gave birth to Timothy McVeigh. Born in nearby Lockport on April the 23rd, 1968, young Timothy was the middle child in a household that was as boring as it was dysfunctional. His father, Bill, worked endless shifts to support his family, while his mother, Mickey, divided her time between going on the road for work and going on the road with other men. Years later, Tim would say that he and his sisters, Patty and Jennifer, saw almost nothing of their parents growing up. Not that the children were isolated good Catholics from Irish stock. The McVeighs were fixtures at the local church and generally lived the sort of lives you'd expect from small-town nobodies. When Mickey finally left in 1978 and took Patsy and Jennifer to live in Florida, it was just another chapter in that American classic, The Great Big Book of Suburban Misery. For 10-year-old Tim, being left alone with Dad Bill effectively meant being left entirely alone. There was nothing to do in Pendleton, and nobody to do it with, especially not when you were a lanky, intelligent, and painfully shy boy that nobody seemed to understand. The only person Tim really connected to in those days was his grandpa. The two would go shooting together, a rare escape from the beatings that Timothy received at school. As he entered his teenage years, the boy, mockingly called Noodle by his classmates, began to develop a vague paranoia that the government might come and take his beloved guns away, depriving him of this one last escape from his miserable life. It was a feeling that he found reflected in the Turner Diaries. Now, if you've never heard of the Turner Diaries, you're probably going to have a fairly miserable next 30 seconds. They were written by a neo-Nazi called William Luther Pierce in 1978, and the book features a white uprising against the Jews and blacks who are controlling America, and it culminates in the whites committing a justified genocide. In short, the Diaries is as textbook a definition of racism as you're ever likely to find, the sort of book Hitler would gobble up for his Nazi breakfast. Yet it also contains perhaps the key to McVeigh's actions. In one passage, the heroes detonate a truck bomb outside a federal building, killing 800 people. For 14-year-old Timothy, reading the Turner Diaries was like someone had opened his eyes. Pierce's book tapped into the deep paranoia the young boy was already feeling. He became a sort of teenage survivalist, stockpiling food for a nuclear war that would never come and ramping up his defenses of the Second Amendment. Plenty of teenagers, though, they go through phases of extremist belief only to later turn into completely normal adults. And this is something that almost happened to Timothy. Something of a computer whiz, he graduated high school in 1986 with a partial scholarship. At this point, the boy's life it could have taken a permanent turn for the ordinary, but it didn't. For whatever reason, Timothy dropped out. After 2 years of bumming around Pendleton, he made the decision that would change his life and the lives of 168 people living in Oklahoma City forever. He decided to join the army. It was spring of 1988 when McVeigh graduated from boot camp and became a paid member of the US military. By all accounts, he was a model soldier. He even managed to make real friends for perhaps the first time in his life, pairing up with two guys called Michael Fortier and Terry Nichols. Like McVeigh, Nichols was a guy from Nowheresville with an absent father. Like McVeigh, Nichols was a Second Amendment advocate with a creeping distrust of the government. And like McVeigh, Nichols would soon choose to express that distrust through horrific violence. But before we get into that, we first got to take a quick trip to the Arabian Desert. August 2nd, 1990, and Saddam Hussein's army rolls into Kuwait, leaving a trail of horror in its wake. Ordinary Kuwaitis are abducted off the streets, tortured to death, and their bodies are dumped on their families' lawns. Over 400,000 people flee the country. Faced with a humanitarian catastrophe, George H.W. Bush orders the U.S. Army to Kuwait's borders. Along with them is Timothy McVeigh. Now a special gunner, McVeigh was at the head of a column that rolled into occupied Kuwait on January 17, 1991. He witnessed the fierce fighting and the collapse of the Iraqi army firsthand. Indeed, he fired one of the earliest shots of the war. As his column moved into the desert, McVeigh pulled the trigger on a cannon shot that blew an Iraqi soldier's head clean off. Although he celebrated at the time, he later told his official biographers that the image of the man's upper body disappearing in a spray of red mist, it came to haunt him. As his platoon marched north along dusty highways littered with burnt-out wreckages of destroyed Iraqi vehicles, his celebration, it gave way to horror. By the time the war ended, on February 28th, something inside McVeigh had gone out. Some vital spark of empathy had gone, and it was never to be rekindled. The next few months were rough for the decorated soldier. Utterly exhausted by the Gulf War, McVeigh flunked the Army Special Forces training after 2 days. He took an honorable discharge and returned to Pendleton, where he failed to find steady work. Traumatized and directionless, he returns to his one real love: guns. In 1991, the gun show circuit was a place of itinerant wanderers, fanatics, and enthusiasts who lived a nomadic existence, roaming the empty plains of America and hawking their wares. McVeigh joins their number, flogging copies of his childhood favorite, The Turner Diaries, to a receptive anti-government audience. At some point, he made contact again with Terry Nichols, who'd left the army on a hardship discharge before the Gulf War. The two went into business, selling army surplus. As they spent more and more time together, they fed fuel into the fire of one another's resentment of the government. But it would be two major events that would turn those smoldering embers into apocalyptic wildfires. At the same time Timothy McVeigh was becoming desensitized to violence in the Arabian Desert, an anonymous man named Randy Weaver was missing his Idaho court date. A former Green Beret, Weaver had taken his wife Vicky and their children and retreated into a tiny survivalist cabin overlooking Ruby Creek. In 1989, ATF agents tried to turn him into an informer. When Weaver refused, he was indicted on firearms offenses. In February 1991, he failed to show up at his trial, and an arrest warrant was issued. On August 21st, 1992, U.S. Marshals finally tracked Weaver to his cabin. As they approached, Weaver's dog Striker started barking. 14-year-old Sammy Weaver came out of the cabin running with his gun in hand. What exactly happened next, no one knows. What we do know is that when the dust cleared, Striker, Sammy, and Deputy Marshal Bill Deegan, they were all dead. The FBI laid siege to the cabin. On August 22nd, FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi shot Randy as he tried to check on Sammy's body. Randy ran for safety and Horiuchi fired again. This time, his shot missed the wounded Randy. As Vicky Weaver stepped up to the doorway, her newborn child in her arms, the bullet struck her through her head, and she died instantly. The deaths of Sammy and Vicky Weaver were like a lightning bolt to the heart of the gun circuit. For McVeigh and Nichols and others like them, Ruby Ridge was proof that the government was coming for your guns and they'd kill your entire family in order to get them. It was in the shadow of this tragedy that an even greater and even more controversial tragedy occurred, and you'll certainly recognize the name of this one because it was Waco. On February 28, 1993, ATF agents raided the Branch Davidians' religious compound outside of Waco after David Koresh was accused of violating firearms regulations. And if you do want to learn more about David Koresh, do check out our video about him. I'm going to link to it in the description below. Now that raid, it turned into a massacre that killed 4 ATF agents and 6 Davidians. The massacre then turned into a standoff before transforming into a siege when the FBI got involved. For the next 51 days, the world watched as Waco became a circus. The firearms angle drew in protesters from across the country, and among them was Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh joined the crowd of journalists, protesters, and rubberneckers on a hill 3 miles from the compound, watching as all the action unfolded. He hawked anti-government bumper stickers and, like many others, predicted another Ruby Ridge. However, he wouldn't be there to see quite how right he was. On April the 19th, the FBI tried to storm the compound. Instead, the world watched in horror as it went up in flames. Billowing black smoke filled the sky, hanging in a poisonous cloud above Texas. To this day, there is still debate over who started the fire, but there's no debate over the outcome. The charred corpses of 75 Davidians were eventually pulled from the rubble. Among them, 25 children. McVeigh watched the Davidians burn live on TV from Nichols' couch on his farm in Michigan. Exactly what he felt seeing his darkest fears realized is, of course, unknown, but we do know that in the aftermath, McVeigh and Nichols began experimenting with building pipe bombs. Their anger at the government had reached a boiling point, and the two men began their slow slide toward extremism and, of course, committing horrifying vengeance. In September of 1994, President Bill Clinton signed into law the assault weapons ban, briefly outlawing certain types of firearms. Coming in the wake of Ruby Ridge and Waco, the ban was like tossing gasoline onto the fire of anti-government propaganda. McVeigh would later claim that this was the last straw. Initially the young extremist, he hoped to assassinate prominent figures in the federal government. Among his targets were Attorney General Janet Reno and Lon Horiuchi, the FBI sniper who'd killed Vicki Weaver at Ruby Ridge. But this plan soon fizzled. Getting past bodyguards was too tricky, and there was no guarantee McVeigh would be able to assassinate even a single figure before being caught. Instead, he turned to an unlikely source of inspiration: Islamic fundamentalism. The year before, just 3 days before the Waco siege, a small Islamist cell had exploded a truck bomb beneath the World Trade Center. The blast had been intended to collapse the North Tower, killing hundreds of people. In the end, though, it failed to damage the foundations and killed only 6 people. For McVeigh, the 1993 WTC bombing was a source of both inspiration and contempt. While he was impressed that such a small cell had managed to attack such a high-profile landmark, he considered their attack a failure. In later years, he admitted to studying the bombing obsessively, and he vowed that he could do better. His first step was to get Terry Nichols involved. Richer than McVeigh and with more practical knowledge in explosives, Nichols was necessary for the success of any attack. So in late September, McVeigh took him to one side and explained his plan. Together, the two of them were going to blow up a federal building, just like in the Turner Diaries. In a happier world, Nichols would have responded by saying, "Yeah, sure, Tim," and then immediately alerting the FBI, but this isn't a happier world. The feds, they were the enemy, and Nichols was just as angry and just as ready to lash out at the government as McVeigh was. So when McVeigh said, "Let's build a bomb," Nichols, he simply said, "Well, yeah." Throughout September, the pair slowly began amassing bags of fertilizer. When they weren't buying, they were hanging out with their old buddy Michael Fortier and setting off pipe bombs in secluded canyons. By October, McVeigh had made a connection who promised to sell them nitromethane, a highly potent racing fuel. On October the 20th, the pair drove to Dallas, Texas to pick up a batch. On the way, they stopped in Oklahoma City. Today, a controversy remains over the point at which McVeigh decided to bomb the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. Some believe the decision was taken in September. Others believe it wasn't until the morning of the bombing when the original target had to be scrapped at the last minute. Whatever the truth, the FBI's official chronology of McVeigh's movements in the fall of 1994 states that he and Nichols pulled over outside the Murrah Building on their way to Dallas. Long after he was arrested, McVeigh would say he'd originally chosen another federal building in the city, but had a change of heart when he noticed it housed a flower store. Evidently, he felt no such reluctance when he saw the Murrah Building's daycare center. It was during the Dallas trip that McVeigh got some unfortunate news. His grandfather had passed away following a long illness. The man who'd once been young Timothy's only friend was now gone. And with that, McVeigh's last connection to the world was severed. The next few months unfolded in a haze of petty crimes, of fertilizer stockpiling and mind-numbing normalcy. McVeigh visited gun shows, tried to hook up with women, and even took a vacation. But below this average bustle of life, something much darker was beginning to take shape. Nichols, by now, was stealing guns to generate funding, and the two were slowly filling countless drums with fertilizer and with fuel. As the 1994 ticked over into 1995, McVeigh was making more and more trips to Oklahoma City, at least once with Fortier in tow. Away from his future target, though, he was starting to dabble in crystal meth and acid. As the winter slipped away into spring, McVeigh, he cut himself off from everyone, even Nichols. By April, he was spending long nights sleeping in his car and lying low in motels. At some point, Fortier's wife made him a fake ID to use for renting vehicles. McVeigh's last week as a free man is still shrouded in mystery. He rented a hotel room in Junction City, Kansas, and may have been spotted conversing with still unidentified men. At some point, a man known as John Doe 2 allegedly rented the Ryder truck used in the blast. Eyewitness accounts of Doe 2 fuel conspiracy theories about the bombing to this very day. As Easter Sunday 1995 arrived, Nichols finally traveled down to Kansas. On April the 18th, he and McVeigh drove out to Geary Lake with their fertilizer and their fuel. As the sun came up over the water, they mixed their ingredients together, creating a highly unstable bomb. By noon, they were done. McVeigh said goodbye, got back in the Ryder truck, and drove off into the bright spring afternoon. The next time Nichols heard his old friend's name, he would be infamous. On April the 19th, 1995, State Trooper Charlie Hanger was out patrolling the empty highways north of Oklahoma City when he spotted a car driving without a plate. It had been a heavy morning. Hanger had just heard on the radio that some kind of explosion had happened in Oklahoma City, and all the cops in the area were converging on the disaster. But Hanger was nothing if not by the book, so rather than turn his car around and scream towards the smoke-filled skyline, he flicked on his lights and pulled over the battered, old, plateless Mercury. A gaunt young man was sat in the driver's seat, a calm expression on his face. As Hanger asked to see his license, he noticed a bulge under the young man's jacket. He was carrying an illegal concealed weapon. The young man followed Hanger's eye line and gave a tight grin. "My gun is loaded, officer," he said. "So is mine," replied Hanger, yanking his pistol out and pointing it at the young man's head. As Hanger drove his prisoner back towards Perry and the local county courthouse, he was passed by more vehicles speeding towards Oklahoma City. It never even occurred to him that he might have the bomber sat in his back seat. The Oklahoma City bomb had exploded at 9:02 a.m. in front of the Mara building. The blast had removed the north wing and collapsed all 9 floors. Windows 25 miles away had shaken from the shockwave. In the aftermath, ordinary Oklahomans had watched in horror as the bloodied corpses of children were pulled from the rubble. All told, 168 lives had been snuffed out. As news spread, so did the suspicion that a foreign power was involved. The bomb was simply too powerful. The media broadcast stories about Arab terrorists attacking the heartland. Grave-looking spokespeople came on TV and said there was a possibility Saddam Hussein had actually orchestrated the attack. In Perry Courthouse, Timothy McVeigh calmly watched these reports unfold. At that moment, he was the most wanted man on the planet, and no one had the faintest inkling that he was already in jail. On Friday morning, 2 days after the bombing, McVeigh was about to go and see the judge and post bail when a frantic FBI operator called Charlie Hanger to ask if his traffic violation guy was still sitting in the cells. Hanger said, "Well, sure." "Keep him there," the operator barked. "Whatever you do, do not let him go." By fluke, the Ryder truck's axle hadn't been destroyed in the blast. Hurled 2 blocks through the air, it had been recovered with its serial number still intact. The FBI managed to trace it back to a motel where McVeigh had stayed using his real name, and with that, the game was up. In Perry, a mob of angry Oklahomans surrounded the courthouse as federal agents arrested McVeigh. Chants of "baby killer" filled the air. As he was dragged out into the media spotlight, McVeigh seemed totally unfazed by the attention. He simply scanned the nearby rooftops, his eyes flitting from one to the other with an eerie calm. McVeigh would later say that he was sure an FBI sniper was about to take him out, as they had with Vicki Weaver 3 years earlier. That would be bad because he didn't want to die until he'd told his story, until he'd explained why he had done it. He was sure that when the American people heard his reasoning, they would rise up against the government, just like in the Turner Diaries. Timothy McVeigh was indicted on August 10, 1995. Terry Nichols had surrendered to authorities the day that McVeigh was identified and was charged as a co-conspirator. Michael Fortier was also arrested and turned star witness in return for a lenient sentence. Of the 3 men, only Fortier would ever taste freedom again. In the end, the trial of Timothy McVeigh took 1 month. McVeigh instructed his lawyers to use a necessity defense, arguing that he was in immediate danger from the government and the bombing was an act of self-defense, but his lawyers, they refused. At the end of the trial, the jury unanimously recommended death by lethal injection. Terry Nichols was sentenced to 161 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Following McVeigh's conviction, jubilant Oklahomans paid to fly the jury out to Oklahoma City and gave them a VIP tour. For a brief period after his trial, McVeigh was incarcerated in ADX Florence, Colorado, in a wing known as Bombers Row. A real-life Arkham Asylum, Bombers Row was already home to Unabomber Ted Kaczynski and WTC bomber Ramzi Ahmed Youssef. According to one of McVeigh's biographers, he and Kaczynski became firm friends, bonding over a love of nature. Youssef, meanwhile, tried to convert McVeigh to Islam, but McVeigh politely declined. McVeigh never expressed any remorse for his actions, and in his biography, he called the 19 dead children collateral damage. He maintains that the bombing was a justified response to Waco, and he wasn't alone. The great writer Gore Vidal became a pen pal of McVeigh's and spent the last years of his life alternately defending McVeigh's actions, at one point comparing him to an American hero, Paul Revere, and suggesting that he was really innocent. While McVeigh respected Vidal, he had no truck with theories that had been framed. He had carried out the bombing, and he wanted everyone to know it. McVeigh was finally executed on July 11, 2001. The day he was put to death, so many natives of Oklahoma City wanted to watch the monster die that a lottery system had to be set up to ration places in the chamber. The rest watched via a satellite link from the very city McVeigh had callously torn the heart out of only 6 years before. At 7:15 a.m., Timothy McVeigh became the first federal prisoner to be executed since 1963. As a cocktail of lethal drugs was slowly pumped into his system, he refused to say a word. With eerie calm, he simply looked into the camera, broadcasting his death to Oklahoma City, forcing his eyes to stay open even as his heart slowed to a stop. When he finally died, his eyes remained fixed on the camera, as if mocking those that it hurt so much. At the moment McVeigh died, he was the mastermind of the deadliest attack in US history. He was the boy next door who'd read a book and dared to turn its plot into a horrifying reality. As his heart stopped, it was on a world in which Americans still feared the government, and right-wing terror was the biggest concern of law enforcement. It was a world that McVeigh had helped to create, but it wasn't one that would last. Exactly 3 months after McVeigh breathed his last, Islamic fundamentalists smashed planes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, killing 17 times as many as McVeigh had. In the aftermath of 9/11, support for the government surged to its highest level in decades. Right-wing terror vanished from the headlines, replaced by the specter of Islamic extremism. In the wake of nearly 3,000 dead in New York City, the bombing of the Mara building was almost forgotten. Yet McVeigh still holds a special place in American history. No domestic terrorist has ever equaled the horrific act that he carried out that day, an act which inspired everyone from the Columbine killers to Anders Breivik. Even today, he casts a long, poisonous shadow. Once again, anti-government fervor is on the rise. Far-right extremists like Dylan Roof and Pittsburgh shooter Robert Bowers are sowing terror in American communities. As the world lurches back towards a darker place, it's worth remembering the life of Timothy McVeigh and the lessons that his awful crime taught us all. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this twice a week. So hit that subscribe button, and as always, thank you for watching.